The screen of the mind opens in darkness. No names, no faces. Only the sound of air trembling against thin metal. A breath, sharp and ragged, swells in the void, followed by the faint rattle of a chain. Then a light, a sickly, narrow sliver of light, cuts across the blackness like a blade. It reveals nothing at first, only fragments, a cracked tile, a corner of rusted steel dust swirling in the air. Then suddenly, a hand appears, small and skeletal, reaching upward with trembling fingers. The hand stretches toward a tiny ventilation slit near the ceiling, clawing desperately for something beyond it. A sob escapes from the darkness so soft it almost doesn't exist. There is no speech, no plea, only a sound, raw with despair. Footsteps thunder from somewhere unseen. A heavy door slams. The light vanishes. The sobbing stops. And then silence. A single phrase seems to echo through that emptiness. 2,916 days. That is how long the crying had gone unheard. Tete. Maplewood, Ohio was a place the world had long forgotten. Rows of tired houses lined cracked sidewalks. Faded paint clung to the walls of homes that had seen better days. People nodded to one another at the grocery store or during Sunday service, but no one looked too closely. No one asked questions that might disturb the fragile quiet of their small town. Silence was safety here. George Bell had lived at 110 Maple Drive his entire life. His house, a weather-beaten two-story structure with peeling shutters, sat only a few yards from the Ross residence at 112. George was a man of habits: coffee at dawn, a crossword puzzle at breakfast, the evening news at 6. But in the months before his death, his habits had faltered. He kept his curtains drawn even on bright days. His phone went unanswered. Neighbors noticed his growing paranoia the way he glanced over his shoulder when he took out the trash or fetched the mail. Some whispered that old age was catching up with him. Others simply didn't care enough to wonder. After George passed away from what the coroner called a heart attack, his belongings were boxed up and left for his granddaughter Laura. She came one rainy afternoon to sort through his things, moving slowly through rooms that smelled of dust and memory. In the back of a wardrobe, Laura found a small, cracked smartphone wrapped in an old handkerchief. It was almost dead, the battery clinging to a final spark of life. She plugged it in and waited. When the screen lit up, there was only one file saved to the gallery, a video, 12 seconds long. Laura hesitated before pressing play. The footage was shaky, as though George had been hiding while recording. Through a dirty, half-closed window, the camera revealed a narrow view of another house, the Ross house next door. The image was blurred by grime and distance, but there, unmistakably, was a hand. A small hand reaching through a ventilation slit, fingers trembling. The clip ended abruptly with a loud bang. Laura stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. She replayed it once, twice, a dozen times. That tiny hand haunted her, speaking of fear and captivity without a single word. Unsure what to do, Laura brought the phone to the police. Detective Michael Hayes was assigned to the case. He had spent 2 decades navigating the bureaucracy and decay of law enforcement in small towns like Maplewood. Experience had taught him a bitter truth. Sometimes the loudest cries were the ones nobody wanted to hear. Michael studied the footage in silence. It was too brief to identify the person, too grainy to prove a crime, yet he couldn't ignore the desperation captured in those 12 seconds. "Where exactly did your grandfather live?" he asked finally, though his voice lacked hope. Laura gave the address, and Michael's expression tightened. He knew the Ross family, at least on paper. David Ross. The father worked construction jobs when he could find them. Martha, the mother, stayed home. Their daughter, Emily, had once been enrolled at Maplewood Elementary, but her records ended abruptly 8 years ago, marked simply as transfer. Michael remembered a few scattered reports, noise complaints, anonymous calls about screaming children, each dismissed as unfounded. He stood pocketing the phone. "I'll check it out," he said, though he didn't believe anyone wanted the truth. The following evening, Michael parked a block away from 112 Maple Drive. The house looked like every other on the street, peeling paint overgrown weeds, a mailbox hanging by a single screw. It radiated neglect, not menace. Through binoculars, he observed for an hour. David Ross returned home carrying a grocery bag. No one else entered or exited. The curtains remained tightly shut. Michael felt the old frustration rise inside him. This could all be nothing, a misinterpretation, a trick of the light. Maybe George's mind had been failing, his paranoia bleeding into the lens of the camera. And yet, that hand. He radioed for backup. The SWAT team arrived silently, their boots crunching on the gravel driveway. With a nod from Michael, they breached the front door. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and something darker, metallic and sour. The living room was cluttered, but ordinary old furniture scattered toys from years past, unpaid bills stacked on the table. Michael moved towards the hallway. A locked door stood at the end, its surface scratched and scarred. He pressed his ear to it and heard nothing. Key, he demanded. David Ross stood pale and silent, his hands trembling. He fished a key from his pocket and held it out without a word. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Tiens. The room beyond was not a room at all. It was a cell. There were no windows, only the faint glow of that same ventilation slit high above. The floor was bare concrete. A stained mattress lay in the corner beside a rusted bucket. Chains glinted faintly in the thin light. And there, huddled against the far wall, was Emily Ross. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her skin ashen. She did not flinch when the officers entered, did not speak or cry. She simply stared as though the world beyond the door was a dream she no longer trusted. Michael's throat tightened. He crouched slowly, speaking in a voice softer than he'd used in years. "Emily," he said. But she did not react. Sarah Miller, the social worker who had accompanied the raid, knelt beside him. "You're safe now," she whispered. Emily blinked once, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Then she turned her gaze upward toward the slit of light as if searching for something that wasn't there. As paramedics carried Emily out on a stretcher, neighbors gathered behind curtains and cracked doors. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, yet no one stepped forward. No one offered help or explanation. Silence held the street like a chokehold. Michael looked at them, then at the house, and felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. Whatever had happened here, it had happened in plain sight. The camera followed Emily's departure, her fragile body disappearing into the flashing lights of the ambulance. And here, for the first time, the narrator's voice breaks through the gloom, gentle but insistent. If this story moves you, if you believe some cries should never go unheard, subscribe now and stay with us until the very end. Your voice matters. The ambulance doors closed. The siren wailed, but the silence on Maple Drive remained unbroken. The morning after Emily's rescue dawned gray and still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The street outside 112 Maple Drive had returned to its usual quiet, but the silence felt different now. Thicker, heavier, as though it carried the weight of secrets too long kept. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by the dull hum of everyday life, yet something in the air refused to settle. It was as if the house itself had exhaled a final, terrible truth and now lay exhausted, stripped of pretense. Detective Michael Hayes stood across the street with a cooling cup of coffee in his hand, staring at the Ross house. The front door hung ajar. Its splintered frame a gaping mouth that swallowed the light. Michael thought of Emily's hollow eyes, her fragile body curled against that filthy wall, and the single slit of ventilation that had been her only glimpse of the outside world for 8 endless years. He had witnessed cruelty before, but this was something darker. A crime so quiet it had become invisible. Maplewood Elementary was a relic of another time, with faded murals on the walls and buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. Michael sifted through dusty filing cabinets in a cramped office until he found Emily's folder. It was disturbingly thin, containing only the essentials: enrollment forms, a few medical records, several grade reports. Everything appeared ordinary until March of 2016, when the records abruptly stopped. Clipped to the last report card was a transfer notice. According to the document, Emily had been moved to St. Matthew's Academy, a private school in the city, on April 1st of that year. The paper bore Martha Ross's signature and an official school seal stamped in deep red ink. Michael's eyes narrowed as he examined it. The stamp was too clean, too perfect, its edges sharp and unworn. And April 1st, he realized, had been a Sunday. Schools didn't process transfers on Sundays. A low anger stirred in his chest as he ran a finger over the forged signature. The secretary beside him, a weary woman with graying hair, peered at the document and shook her head slowly. "I've worked here for 15 years, she murmured. "I never saw this. It's wrong." Michael closed the folder carefully, his mind already forming the picture. Emily had not simply disappeared. She had been erased. A single sheet of paper had turned her into a ghost, and no one had questioned it. Back at the precinct, a financial report awaited him. When Michael opened it, the numbers burned into his vision like a slow poison. For 9 consecutive years on the same day, each month, $500 had been deposited into David Ross's account. The payments were labeled as caregiver support for a disabled minor. Emily's name appeared on every line. At first glance, it seemed routine, a sign of state assistance. But each deposit was withdrawn in full within 24 hours. Always in cash. Always from the same ATM 2 blocks away. Michael requested the security footage. For years, David appeared exactly the same, baseball cap pulled low, head down, his movements mechanical. Then came the recording from March 9, 2024. David was visibly different. He twitched, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly as he withdrew the cash. His hands trembled. 4 days later, George Bell was dead. The day after George's death, David purchased 10 bags of quick-drying cement and steel reinforcement bars, paying in cash. The realization hit Michael with a sickening clarity. The money meant to care for Emily had instead been used to fortify her prison. What should have been her lifeline had become her chains. He walked the neighborhood that evening, speaking with neighbors who answered their doors reluctantly. Most claimed ignorance. Some admitted they hadn't seen Emily in years but assumed she had moved away. Others confessed to hearing strange noises, crying, banging muffled thuds, but they told themselves it was nothing. Domestic disputes, a television left too loud, no one had wanted to look too closely. Finally, Michael spoke with Claire Adams, Martha's sister. She stood on her porch with arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground. After a long, tense silence, she whispered, "I suspected something. I saw the way Emily vanished. But I didn't trust the system." Her voice cracked as she went on. "Years ago, I reported a different neighbor for abuse. The police came, asked questions, and then nothing. A week later, my windows were smashed. My tires were slashed. No one protected me. No one ever does. So, when I suspected David, she faltered, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I looked away, because I was afraid." Michael left her porch with the bitter taste of helplessness in his mouth. Fear had spread through this street like a sickness, infecting everyone until silence was the only language they spoke. It was this silence that had buried Emily, that had kept her hidden while the world went on around her. As the narrator's voice broke through, soft but urgent, it carried a plea. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, if you think silence should never be the answer, subscribe now and stay with us. Your support helps bring light to the darkest corners. In the hospital, Sarah Miller sat beside Emily's bed. Emily had not spoken a single word since the rescue. At first, she refused even to look at Sarah, retreating into herself like a frightened animal. But Sarah noticed how Emily's fingers moved constantly, tracing shapes on the blanket, drawing invisible pictures no one else could see. She brought Emily paper and crayon, setting them gently on the bedside table. Slowly, painfully, Emily began to draw. At first, there were only harsh lines and dark smudges. Then, images emerged: a square room with no windows. A bucket. A thin beam of light cutting across the floor. Always there were eyes watching from the darkness beyond the door. One day, Emily drew something different. A figure standing outside the door, unmoving, silent. The child on the other side reached out, but the figure never came in. Sarah's heart ached as she realized what Emily was telling her without words. Someone had been there. Someone had stood just beyond Emily's reach and yet done nothing. On the third day of the investigation, the forensic team began tearing apart the Ross bathroom. Michael stood in the hallway watching as they used scanners and drills, their movements precise and methodical. It was then that they discovered a hollow section beneath the back wall. When they pried it open, a narrow tunnel yawned beneath their feet, descending into darkness. The air that rose from it was damp and cold, reeking of mildew and secrets. The tunnel stretched beneath the yard, leading to a hidden exit behind a tangle of ivy and rotted wood. From the outside it was invisible, just another patch of neglect. Inside, the team found footprints. Small, light. A woman's footprints. Michael's stomach churned. There was only one woman who should have been there, Martha Ross. That evening, the lab called with the results of George Bell's autopsy. Under his fingernails, they had found trace DNA. The sample matched Martha. Michael sat alone in his office, staring at the report until the letters blurred. He thought of Laura's trembling hands when she showed him the video. He thought of Emily's silent drawings. He thought of George, a man who had tried to raise the alarm only to be silenced forever. George had not simply died of fear or age. He had fought. He had reached for help, and someone had made sure his voice would never be heard again. Later that night, Laura brought Michael an old photograph she had found in her grandfather's drawer. It showed the Ross family at a summer barbecue in 2019. David stood tall, one arm draped over Martha's shoulders. Daniel, Emily's younger brother, grinned at the camera, his face smeared with melted ice cream. But Emily was nowhere in sight. Michael studied the background carefully. There, at the very edge of the frame, half hidden by the fence, was a shadowy figure. Thin, frail, standing apart from the others. The figure's head was bowed, arms crossed tightly over its chest. It was Emily. She had been there watching her own family from behind the fence, unseen and unacknowledged. Michael returned to Maple Drive as night fell. He stood in the overgrown yard staring at the hidden door behind the ivy. This was how it had been done. Someone could come and go without ever passing through the main house. Emily had never mentioned it in her drawings because she had never known it existed. He imagined Martha descending those steps, standing outside her daughter's prison, her hand hovering over the latch but never turning it. He imagined the sound of Emily crying on the other side, reaching for a mother who never came. The night was silent around him, but Michael could almost hear it, the echo of a sob swallowed by 8 years of darkness. He whispered into the emptiness, though no one was there to answer. "Why didn't you open it?" The only response was the rustling of leaves and the cold certainty that some doors were never meant to stay closed yet. They did. Night crept over Maplewood like a silent tide, swallowing the houses one by one, leaving only a few pale windows flickering like distant stars. In his office, Detective Michael Hayes sat alone, staring at the dim glow of a desk lamp. Papers lay scattered before him. Financial statements, autopsy reports, photographs. Each document told a fragment of the story, but none could explain the part that mattered most: why. He had built the timeline brick by brick. Emily vanished on March 28, 2016. A forged transfer paper appeared days later, erasing her from the school's records. Welfare payments began immediately after. The neighbors went silent. The street closed its eyes. And in that silence, Emily was buried alive, not beneath the soil, but behind walls and lies. George Bell had tried to speak, tried to show the world what he saw. The 12-second video on his phone was proof of that. But 4 days after he captured that trembling hand through the dirty window, George was dead. And now, in the sterile language of a lab report, Michael held the truth traced DNA under George's fingernails, a desperate final fight. A name, Martha Ross. The weight of it pressed down on him. The mother, the one person who should have been Emily's salvation, was part of the darkness. He could almost see it, George stumbling in the narrow tunnel, a flashlight beam jerking wildly, Martha's shadow blocking his path. A struggle in the dark. A cry cut short. Silence again. Martha sat alone in the interrogation room, her hands folded in her lap. The fluorescent light overhead hummed, casting harsh shadows across her pale face. She looked smaller than Michael remembered, diminished like someone who had been shrinking for years. When he entered, she did not look up. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I didn't put her there," she said. "I never locked the door." Michael sat across from her, his hands resting flat on the table. He didn't respond. Silence was its own kind of interrogation. Finally, Martha lifted her eyes. They were red-rimmed but strangely dry, as though she had long ago exhausted her tears. David said she'd run away. Then one night he brought her back. She was wild, screaming. He told me she was sick out of control, and that if anyone found out they'd take her away forever. They'd say we were unfit parents. Her breath caught, and for a moment she looked like she might shatter. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, because the truth was worse. Michael listened unmoving. He had learned long ago that confessions were rarely about facts. They were about survival. Martha's voice hardened. He told me the room was temporary, a place to keep her safe while she calmed down. But weeks passed, months, and the door never opened. Her hands trembled as she went on. I tried to argue. I told him it was wrong. He slammed me against the fridge. After that, I stopped arguing. A pause, heavy and bitter. I was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do to her, to me, to Daniel. Michael could almost see at the house at night the muffled sobs behind the bathroom door. Martha standing frozen in the hallway knowing she should move but unable to take a single step. Sometimes she whispered, "I went down the tunnel. I stood outside her door. She didn't know I was there." I would press my hand against the wood and listen to her cry. Her voice broke at last, but I never opened it. Michael's jaw tightened. Why, he asked, his voice low. Martha flinched as if struck. Because he said if I did, he'd kill her, and I believed him. He was stronger, meaner. He had this way of making you doubt yourself. I thought maybe if I just stayed quiet, he'd let her out eventually. She drew in a shuddering breath. One night, I tried to stop him. I waited until he was asleep. I took a knife from the kitchen. I couldn't do it. My hands wouldn't move. And when he woke up and saw me, she closed her eyes, a tremor running through her. That was the night he built the wall thicker. After that, there was no hope. The room fell silent. Michael realized there were no true villains or heroes here, only people who had failed in different ways. But failure did not erase the damage. Jake. While Martha spoke in halting words, Emily spoke through images. At the hospital, Sarah Miller sat beside her as she drew with crayons. Emily's face remained blank, but her hands moved with feverish intensity. First, she drew the room square, colorless, a single slash of light cutting across the floor. Next, she added a door. Behind it, a dark figure loomed faceless and enormous. In the corner, a smaller figure curled into a ball herself. Then came the drawing that made Sarah's throat tighten. A hallway, a narrow tunnel, and a woman standing at the threshold, her hand pressed to the door but never opening it. On the other side, a small hand reached back. Emily's art was a map of betrayal, each stroke a memory too painful for words. Sarah kept the drawings carefully, knowing they were evidence as much as they were therapy. Michael pieced the story together from fragments. George had known. He had heard Emily's cries through the wall. At first he tried to warn others, but no one believed him. Fear was stronger than truth on this street. So George gathered evidence alone, filming through his window in secret. The 12-second video was only the beginning. There had been a second recording, but it was corrupted, nearly lost forever. When technicians finally restored it, the image was grainy and brief, 7 seconds of blurred motion. But it was enough to see George stepping into the tunnel with a flashlight, his breath loud in the narrow space. A shadow moved behind him. Then the screen went black. Michael imagined George stumbling backward, struggling, fighting for his life in the darkness, while above them Emily reached through the slit, her cries unheard. When George's body was later found, no one asked questions. A heart attack, they said. Just another old man fading quietly away. But now Michael knew better. The silence had teeth, and it devoured anyone who tried to break it. Qui. That night, Michael visited Emily. She sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by crayons and scraps of paper. When he entered, she didn't look up. Instead, she slid a new drawing toward him. In the picture, a house stood divided in two halves. On one side, a father walked away carrying a bag of money. On the other, a mother sat on the ground, weeping. Between them, a girl reached out with both hands trapped behind a wall. Michael's throat ached as he studied it. Emily had condensed 8 years of suffering into a single image. For the first time since the investigation began, he felt the urge to cry. As he left the hospital, the narrator's voice rose one final time, calm but resolute. If you've stayed with us this far, you know the power of a story told. Subscribe now and help ensure that no voice, no matter how small, is ever lost to the darkness again. It was the third and last plea, a candle lit against the shadows. In the darkness outside, the Ross house loomed like a monument to every silence that had allowed this horror to grow. Michael knew the truth now, but truth alone was never enough. The next battle would not be fought in tunnels or locked rooms. It would be fought in courtrooms under glaring lights before a crowd that had once chosen to look away. Emily's voice would never return in words, but she had given them her drawings, her testimony carved in color and pain. Michael vowed to see that voice heard, no matter the cost. The courthouse in downtown Maplewood was an aging building, its walls yellowed with time, its halls lined with portraits of judges long dead. On the morning of the trial, the air inside seemed heavier than usual, filled with a restless hum as people gathered to witness what they hoped would be justice. The case had drawn attention from across the county, but the faces in the gallery were familiar neighbors, former teachers, people who had walked past the Ross house for years without ever knocking on the door. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polish. A judge's gavel rested at the center, its wooden handle gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Michael Hayes stood near the back, arms crossed, watching as the crowd settled into place. He felt the tension like a physical weight pressing on his chest. This was the moment where silence would either be broken or sealed forever. David Ross entered first, escorted by 2 officers. He looked thinner than the night of his arrest, his face hollowed out, but his posture still rigid, defiant. His eyes scanned the room without emotion, as if daring anyone to meet his gaze. Martha entered next, separate from him now, her head bowed, hands clutching a crumpled tissue. She took a seat behind the prosecution table, not as a defendant, but as a witness and as a mother stripped bare before the world. Emily came last. She moved slowly, deliberately, accompanied by Sarah Miller, who walked beside her like a silent guardian. Emily's frame was still fragile, her skin pale from years without sunlight, but her presence filled the room in a way no one expected. Every whisper ceased as she entered. People stared, some in shame, some in pity, and some with the uneasy recognition of their own complicity. Emily did not look at them. Her eyes remained forward-focused on the empty chair at the witness stand. The trial began with the low murmur of legal formalities. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Claire Bennett, rose to speak. Her voice was steady but edged with anger. "This is not just a case about one man," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "This is about a system of silence. A silence so deep that a child could vanish for 8 years while those around her chose not to see." She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the forged school documents, the welfare payments, the hidden tunnel, the autopsy report on George Bell. Photographs were displayed on a screen, one after another. The bathroom, as it had been, found the chains, the stained mattress, the scratched walls. Each image struck the room like a blow. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes glistening, hands gripping the edges of benches. When the video played, the 12 seconds George had recorded, the silence became unbearable. That tiny hand reaching through the slit of light filled the screen. There were muffled gasps, someone stifled a sob, and Martha buried her face in her hands. Michael looked away. He had seen it too many times, and yet it never lost its power. The defense argued that David had acted out of misguided care, that Emily had been mentally unstable and dangerous, that the room had been a form of protection. Their words felt brittle absurd against the weight of evidence. Still, they spoke because even monsters were entitled to a voice in court. When Martha took the stand, the room leaned forward as one. She looked smaller than ever, her voice trembling as she answered questions. "I loved my daughter," she said. And for a moment the words hung in the air like a fragile truth. But then came the harder questions. Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you open the door? Martha's face crumpled. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Because I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd let her go. Because every time I tried to fight back, he reminded me how powerless I was. The prosecutor's voice was sharp. And in that silence, Emily suffered. Martha's tears spilled over silent endless. She did not ask for forgiveness. She knew none would come. Then finally, it was Emily's turn. She walked to the witness stand with Sarah at her side. The room held its breath. Everyone expected her to speak, to tell her story in words, but Emily had not spoken a single sentence since the day she was found. She carried a sealed envelope in her hands. Slowly, she placed it on the table before the judge. The clerk opened it and began to read. My name is Emily Ross. The letter began, written in careful, precise script. I am 19 years old. For 8 of those years I lived behind a wall. I saw no windows. I touched no sunlight. I counted the days by the sound of footsteps outside my door. The words flowed like water, painting a picture of darkness and isolation. Emily wrote of hunger, of fear, of the strange way time stopped when there was no one to share it with. She wrote of her mother's footsteps pausing outside the door of the hope that would rise and then collapse when the latch never turned. Sometimes the letter read, I thought she would come for me. Sometimes I believed she was building a plan to save me. But each time she walked away. The clerk's voice trembled as he read the final lines. People ask me what I want now. I want very little. I want to live in a room with windows. I want to open a door and not be afraid of who is behind it. I want to see the sky and know it belongs to me. When he finished, the room was silent. Not the oppressive silence of Maple Drive, but a silence of collective grief of a wound finally exposed to air. Emily did not return to her seat. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single drawing. She placed it on the table where everyone could see. The image was simple, almost childlike, a house split in 2 halves. On one side, a father walked away carrying a bag of money. On the other, a mother sat weeping. In the center, a girl reached toward a wide-open door. Beyond it stretched a vast, unbroken sky. Beneath the drawing, 3 words were written in block letters, I am here. The effect was electric. Some people wept openly. Others bowed their heads. Even the judge's eyes glistened. David stared at the drawing without expression while Martha covered her mouth to stifle a sob. The judge called for a recess. As the room emptied, Michael remained standing, staring at the drawing. It was more than testimony, it was a reclamation. Emily had taken the story that others tried to bury and made it her own. Outside the courthouse the day was cold but clear. Emily stepped into the open air, her head tilted upward. Martha followed at a distance, clutching her tissue like a lifeline. Emily, she whispered. Emily stopped but did not turn. I'm sorry, Martha said, her voice breaking. For a moment there was only the sound of wind through the bare trees. Then Emily spoke, her voice soft but steady, the first word she had uttered in years. I know. She walked away without looking back. Michael watched from the steps, his heart heavy and strangely light all at once. The verdict had not yet been given, but in that moment it didn't matter. Justice was not a single gavel strike. It was this, a girl standing in sunlight, free. As Emily moved toward the waiting car, her face turned to the sky. A single tear slid down her cheek. Not the tears of fear she had shed in the darkness, but a tear of release. The last tear. Michael turned to leave his thoughts a quiet vow. This would not be the last story. There were others still hidden behind walls, still reaching through slits of light, and as long as he breathed, he would listen. The camera would linger on Emily one final time, her figure small against the vast horizon. She lifted her hand toward the sky, fingers open, ready to claim the life that had always been hers. And then softly, the narrator's closing words. This story began with silence. It ends with a voice. If you have walked this path with us, let it change you. Let it remind you to speak, to see, to care. And never forget, sometimes the smallest voice is the one that saves us all. The screen would fade to black, leaving only the echo of that single, unbroken truth: Emily was here. And she was free.